Hello and welcome back to the rise and fall of the chill out room, ambient house and ambient techno 1989 to 1996. This time I'll be looking at some releases from 1992. The release rate of relevant music has gone up dramatically in this year, so 1992 will be spread over more than one video. At the end of 1991, a pair of producers based in London put out a 12-inch single. It was their 10th release of the year, using one of 8 different aliases. With some very successful rave-friendly hardcore, techno and house under their belts, their label sat on the release for months, not even considering it worth releasing. Eventually they were persuaded to put it out, and despite not really sounding like much else around at the time, it sold out immediately. The track was Papua New Guinea, the group The Future Sound of London. In order to cash in on its success, the label, Jumpin' and Pumpin', finally released the duo's album Accelerator, which they'd also been sitting on for months. Containing the full 6-minute version of Papua New Guinea with the 2-minute ambient intro, it was for a while the only way to get a hold of the track. Accelerator isn't really an ambient album, but it fits on the edge of the ambient scene at the start of 1992. Sure, tracks like Expander and Moscow are closer to late 90s big beat than anything remotely ambient leaning, and every track here, Papua New Guinea aside, has a 4-to-the-floor pulse. But there are some surprisingly mellow moments. Stolen Documents owes a lot to the jazzier end of US dance music, but its structure is complex and surprisingly detailed, with layers coming and going throughout. The pads and bleeps of Calcium are melancholic and bring a cool, downbeat vibe to the piece. It's Not My Problem's grim, dark undertones would fit well on Biosphere's debut, and Pulse State is a stunning down-tempo acid classic, the kind of track that would be at home on one of Warp's Artificial Intelligence releases. Compared to the majority of their other material from the time, the tracks on Accelerator are that bit slower, that bit softer, that bit more complex, and the album fits alongside better early IDM works than its hardcore contemporaries on Jumpin' and Pumpin'. Of course, it's really Papua New Guinea that's gone on to define this era of the band. In some ways, the largely rave-minded label were right to consider it a risky move, but they hadn't considered the growing taste for more exotic dance music nor the sheer beauty of the track itself. With its dubby bass line, mid-tempo breaks, countless samples, flutes, synth sweeps, pianos, congas, and of course the soaring pads and Lisa Gerrard's haunting vocal, sampled from Dead Can Dance's Dawn of the Iconoclast, it's hard to imagine a world where the track wouldn't become an era-defining anthem. Instead of simply pressing up more copies of the original 12-inch, the band worked on a new set of mixes for its reissue, much in the way the Orb had done in previous years. The 1992 version took the track into the charts, and Papua New Guinea became possibly the first track of the 90s ambient era to be performed on Top of the Pops. The 1992 reissue is packed with a set of remixes that are somewhat unconventional, a term that would go on to define FSOL over coming years. Andy Weatherall's remix is a 12-minute epic blending sci-fi synths, heavy dub and ethnic chants into a multi-part suite that doesn't feature the famous Gerrard vocal. The dub mix, instead of heading into Orbish territory, runs a chunky sampled dub beat for around 30 seconds before collapsing into a pile of cluttered samples and sputtering to a halt. Instead of inviting fellow ambient artists like the Orb and Biosphere to remix, instead 808 State's Graham Massey is brought in to provide a jazzy saxophone workout over the original, while former DJ at London's premier goth club The Batcave, Hamish MacDonald brings in the mellowest mix, with some tribal-leaning ambient laden with all manner of samples. The Dumb Child of Q version strips the original of its drums to create a tenser nocturnal version, and the Journey to Pyramid features some exotic modal melodies. Weatherall's is the only mix to feature a 4-to-the-floor kick, making the whole EP at home on the home stereo more than the dance floor. It's a bold experimental set of mixes that showed FSOL were very much moving away from dance music and embracing the new ambient sound. Incredibly, they'd pitched another single to Jumpin' and Pumpin' and had it turned down for being too weird. Again. The label apparently hadn't learned. The track was called New Life Forms and would go on to become the title track to the second FSOL album. But that's a story for another time. After signing to Virgin Records, FSOL handed over a few more dance tracks to Jumpin' and Pumpin' before taking to Kiss FM to start developing a new soundscape approach which would define their later sound. I talk about Accelerator and Papua New Guinea among the band's many other releases in my Earthbeat Visions series of videos, links below or find them elsewhere in my channel. There are a large number of electronic music artists still active today whose careers started in the ambient boom of the early 90s. One of these was David Mufang. an artist who has worked under numerous aliases and in many projects, but is probably best known as Move D. Together with frequent collaborator Jonas Grossman, he set up Source Records in 1992. The first release on the label was the self-titled album by Earth to Infinity, one of the first albums to be clearly inspired by early ambient house releases. With its blend of down-tempo beats, pastoral ambience and heavy sampling, it's rough around the edges but absolutely at one with artists like the Orb. Open at the Gate melds tribal percussion with Led Zeppelin electric piano and squelchy bass to create a soothing and relaxing environment that welcomes the listener. The tone then becomes darker on Memphis to Mars, and we enter a strange world where acidic synths squelch wildly against oddly jazzy synth presets which would feel more at home on a late 80s New Age record. There's a very, very strange playfulness to a lot of what Move D touches, and nowhere more so than on Earth to Infinity. Jazz loops combined with soul vocals and disconcerting wailing synths, creating a woozy feeling reminiscent of a pretty bad trip. Whether it's humour or darkness, the best records of this era always have something more at play than simple relaxation music. With its emphasis on synth pads and vocal samples, Morphic Fields brings the mood back to relaxation with a thump, although a steady house beat brings in some energy near the end. This to and fro between lighter and darker sounds kind of defines the album, with tracks like Clavius opening on some fairly bleak drones before growing into an almost childlike playful piece, only to be derailed by jarring jazz piano, or Soylent Green, which veers from the kind of beautiful synth ambient that could fit along the best tracks of the era to bizarre show tunes and folk music and back again. Sadly, this amount of sampling does have a downside. Mufang has stated the number of uncleared samples on the album makes it next to impossible to reissue. It was reissued once on America's Silent Records in 1994, sadly minus the evocative low-res spacey art. I'll get on to Silent's artwork in a later video. It's a very scrappy record at times. That synth flute preset in Mars to Memphis is surely enough to put some people off on its own. But it also fizzes with that kind of creativity only found when artists are starting out and finding their own sound. Apparently Grossman spent earlier sessions providing samples and ideas, but didn't even want to touch the gear, showing how new he was to the process. If one can hear elements of the Orb and the Irresistible Force in here, they came out the other end warped and mangled and very much their own thing. When Mufang and Grossman reappeared the following year under the name Deep Space Network, they would release a better known, better loved and more rounded album with Big Rooms. And while that is arguably the superior record, there's a lo-fi weirdness to Earth to Infinity that is enough alone to recommend it. Stefan and Dimitri van Elsum, two Belgian brothers, were Antwerp musicians specialising in dance music and jazz respectively. Through a connection with the label, they were offered the opportunity to record an album for Buzz, the short-lived but hugely influential imprint known for their imports of Detroit techno. Perhaps that stylistic direction is why the resulting record, Sublunar Oracles, released under the name Trans-4M, is one of the most unfairly overlooked albums of the era. Had it been released on a different label, or even a year later, one can imagine Sublunar Oracles being one of the name-checked albums of the 90s ambient scene, alongside similar works by a higher intelligence agency in the space-time continuum. Instead, it spent many years in relative obscurity, loved by those in the know but unheard by everyone else. A 2019 reissue by Safe Trip brought some much deserved attention to this wonderful little album, and hopefully the record's audience has grown much in the years since. If Biosphere's ambient version of techno the previous year brought a cold European starkness to the genre, Sublunar Oracles retains the jazzy warmth of many of its American counterparts. Opener Arrival lightly bounces on air, reaching for the stars but continually grounded by its feather-like rhythm. The piece closes with field recordings of a city, including Hare Krishna singers, which suggests some purpose or theme, and indeed there is apparently a narrative to the album, although it remains unpublished, the brothers leaving the music open to the listener's interpretation. Density, meanwhile, manages to be uplifting and melancholic at the same time. Wistful pads, wispy hi-hat rhythms, and HAL 9000 samples. This is all mellow techno sounds, of course, with its layers of gurgling sounds, field recordings, descending synth melodies and occasional whispered percussion. Depth Probe is one of the most densely textured ambient pieces released by this point, looking ahead to albums like Lifeforms and Orbis Terrarum in its detailed production. In contrast, Athava Veda pits jazz sax against tribal drum loops in an odd meeting of worlds that works far better than it really should. Singularity, meanwhile, closes out the album on a downbeat note, a purely beatless ambient piece with melancholic piano improvisation and sci-fi samples. Whatever the story being told here is, it doesn't have an especially happy ending. With its mix of field recordings, gentle techno beats and beautiful synth melodies, Sublunar Oracles features the best there is to offer from the ambient scene in 1992, and hopefully its reputation as a lost classic will continue to draw in new listeners to enjoy the wonderful sounds of Trans-4M's immaculate debut. The interest in original copies of albums remains, even in this final forward era, meaning that the 1992 CD edition of the album often sells for more than the 2LP reissue. The Van Helsens would record a further Trans-4M album 3 years later, concurrently with their more techno-leaning project Brain Pilot. Heinz Roth founded IQ Records in 1990 along Sven Vath, and in 1992 Recycle or Die. The latter was the first label to be dedicated to new ambient music of the 90s, with digipack sleeves, a rarity at this point, and covers designed by contemporary artists, some of which were displayed in a Recycle or Die exhibition in 1994, as well as limited metal box cases and a manifesto to continue in the spirit of the German avant-garde music scene. Recycle or Die also brought a certain amount of seriousness to what was still a largely playful music scene. While never crossing into academic music, the label nevertheless presented ambient as grounds for experimentation with ties to a historically important era of music and art. Of all the labels associated with the era, it was also the one with the smallest output, amounting to 10 albums and 1 compilation in its 5-year lifespan. The first album on the label was Dominic Woosey's Straylight. Woosey had previously released a couple of albums as Neutron 9000, with material ranging from downtempo electro to vocal house, all with a reasonably commercial sound, and this was his first proper foray into ambient. With a handful of earlier albums showing some influence from the cosmiche sound of the 1970s, Straylight is the first 90s ambient record to fully embrace it. Sidelong tracks built around minor key sequence and spacey pads. With this comes the best and worst of the style. Opener Stray Dawn First Light is gorgeous, a slow-moving, ever-evolving jaunt into outer space. On the other hand, others can be tediously noodly, with extensive guitar soloing reminiscent of the worst excesses of the proggy end of Berlin school music. In turns evocative and self-indulgent, one's experience of Straylight will depend entirely on where their taste lies on the prog-punk spectrum, assuming such a thing exists. Personally, I could happily take the wonderful opening track and the heartbreaking piano closer Straylight song without the 2 noodly guitar pieces in the middle. Nevertheless, I can appreciate that well into 92 the ambient scene was still bringing out entirely new perspectives on the sound. With the number of electronic albums on the rise, the ambient scene definitely played an influential role in the format's move towards a more focused, purposeful record opposed to the 3 singles and a bunch of filler approach which had been common before now. A record like Sequencial's Big Cahoona, although not especially ambient in itself, contains a handful of mellower pieces that provide a much needed breather between the harder hitting tracks, and tracks like the Holy Inner Mind, Pure Materialization and Without Within would be completely at home in an ambient house mix. After a very busy 1991, one could have forgiven Alex Patterson for taking it easy in 92. However, the appearance of Towers of Dub on the Perpetual Dawn single was a sign that new material was in the works. The first of this to see light of day was Blue Room, the group's first single in many months, which came out at the start of June 92, and it was quite a statement, using the rules surrounding the length of chart-eligible singles in the UK as a goal rather than a limitation. Patterson and Weston, now the core duo behind the project, created an epic ambient dub track lasting 39 minutes and 59 seconds. Setting the unbeatable record for longest ever charting single in the UK, Blue Room was also memorable for its Top of the Pops performance, in which Alex and Thrash sat and played a surreal game of chess on stage. Blue Room has become one of those legendary Top of the Pops moments, highlighting both the Orb's whimsy and the unconventional nature of the ambient scene. Over its various formats, the Blue Room single came back with 3 excerpts of the full-length piece, as well as a remix by Frank DeWolf and a Mad Professor remix of Towers of Dub. Minus the Gallup chart restrictions, the European release popped all the tracks onto one disc for the CD release, making the excerpts somewhat redundant, but full marks for thoroughness. The US release was slightly delayed and came with later single Assassin on the B-side. Blue Room is a fantastic preview of the second Orb album, highlighting all the updates in the group's sound. Gone is the slightly rough around the edges, scrappy cut and paste sound of Adventures, replaced by a much thicker, smoother mix. The track opens on an extended atmospheric intro, field recordings, samples, synth gurgles and hints of what's to come, creating a wonderful sonic soup that it's easy to sink into. Once the track properly gets going, breaks are joined by a 4-to-the-floor kick and thick swabs of bass by jar wobble grounding the track. It's a world away from the simple clattering drum loops of the band's debut album. Throughout, samples are overlaid with more precision and grace than before, while the track's main synths and vocal sample provide a seductively eerie mood. The whole thing feels much denser and more detailed than anything the Orb had produced before, and it's a remarkable progression in such a relatively short space of time. The use of an air raid siren sample is haunting, adding to the surreal darkness of the piece, while Steve Hillage's guitar, the track's another System 7 collaboration, is processed to sound much smoother and more fitting with the rest of the track than it ever was before. With such emphasis on atmospherics and textures, the track feels more conventionally ambient than the group's earlier work, effectively bringing to mind alien landscapes thriving with indescribable life. Remarkably, it charted inside the UK top 10, leading to the aforementioned Top of the Pops performance. While Adventures and its singles had cracked the top 100, the album at 29 being their highest position so far, which was impressive for the Orb's comparatively uncommercial sound, hitting the top 10 was quite a remarkable feat. Papua New Guinea had been eclipsed as the scene's most commercially successful track. Although nothing could prepare for the biggest shock, a month later the second Orb album, UFOrb, went straight in at the top of the UK album charts. Ambient House truly had arrived. The album features all the strengths and updates of the single itself, stretched across 74 minutes. From the beatless opener OOBE with its nocturnal insect sounds, dreamy pads and snaky eastern sounding flute played by Tom Green, to the trancy arpeggios and exotic vocal samples of Majestic via the title track's deep dubby chimes, the album evokes tropical landscapes, alien vistas, murky swamps, lush rainforests. The beats hit harder, the synths run deeper, the textures are thicker, the atmospherics more visceral. It's all round a huge growth from the band's debut album. The samples are fewer and more subtly placed, but still very much present. Towers of Dub opens with An Ting, a previously released prank call by anarchic radio comic Victor Lewis Smith, before heading into the album's most down-to-earth section, the track's gently rolling acoustic drums and jaunty harmonica solos feeling like a link to the debut album. No surprise that the track was first heard a year before UFOrb's release. Blue Room is cut to a more manageable 17 minutes, it's probably the definitive version of the track, and the abstract sections linking the tracks are extended well beyond the brief bursts of samples the group had used prior to these, beginning to approximate the dense collages the Future Sound of London would later describe as environments. UFOrb is one of the key albums in the whole 90s ambient movement. Not only for the obvious reasons, its number one spot being the scene's commercial peak and undoubtedly marking it the entry point for thousands of listeners, but also because, for me, this is the moment where ambient house really starts living up to its potential. This isn't a DIY collage held together by sticky tape, pieced together in squats and hastily rented studios by a ragtag bunch of Alex Patterson's mates, but a fully formed, polished album that not only succeeds as chill-out music, but fully delivers on the promise of ambient music. It creates a sonic world that's exciting to explore again and again, still sounding as evocative and visual today as it did on release more than 30 years ago. Instead of capitalising on the album's huge success, this was an album that knocked Lionel Richie off the number one spot, with a second single, the title track being an obvious choice, Alex & Co instead decided to release a new non-album track next. Assassin feels like a slightly odd choice, a track building on the trancier sound of UFOrb tracks like Close Encounters and Majestic, to the extent that it practically forgoes any hint of ambient in favour of driving house rhythms and bubbling arpeggios. Without the hooks of tracks like Perpetual Dawn or Blue Room, it could easily have been a flop. Undoubtedly the hype around the album and the group's sizable fan base at the time helped, but not only did Assassin enter the charts from the top 20, but remarkably it climbed to a peak of number 12 the following week. The risk had paid off. The largely beatless Chocolate Hills of Bohol mix on the B-side showed the band still had one finger in the ambient pie, while Bandulu's remix of UFOrb was aimed straight at the dance floor. Once again, Patterson wasn't taking it easy, and a couple more Orb releases rounded out the year. The first was the long in production Patterns and Textures full-length video, effectively a 50-minute music video featuring material from Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. It blends the kind of trippy, psychedelic visual matter often seen alongside this kind of music, colour-swapped nature footage, primitive computer graphics, snippets of live footage, with a selection of tracks from an Orb gig in Brixton. Little Fluffy Clouds, Earth, Towers of Dub, a radically remixed version of Perpetual Dawn, a gorgeously expanded Star 6 and 789 Phase 2, and Outlands all feature, and a limited number of copies of the video included the soundtrack as a bonus CD. It's a lovely release, and like a lot of this era's material, has been sadly out of print for years. The remaining Orb release of '92 is an oddity. Sentinel Total Overhaul by Oldfield vs the Orb. This is a remix of the opening section of and lead single from Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells 2. Maybe one day I'll do a series about Oldfield and get into why I personally think Tubular Bells 2 is one of the least artistically worthwhile albums ever recorded, but for the moment I'll just quote thrash. After we met the manager and Oldfield himself, we went into the studio and Alex played me the tape. We listened and just cracked up. It was really bad. I just couldn't believe all this nice Trevor Horn production, which was like elevator music. The original is a slight retooling of the opening section of the original Tubular Bells, the Exorcist theme part, and there are definitely hints of it present throughout the 2 quarter-hour remixes on this single, although if you weren't listening for it you'd not be any the wiser. The Nobel Prize mix is basically a fairly repetitive slice of minimal electro, all drum machines and synth sweeps, not the kind of thing you might expect from the Orb at this time. The Orbular Bells mix drops the beat and focuses on synth pads and layers of sound thrown through seemingly infinite dubby delays. Again, using the hyper-digital Sentinel as source material gives it a strangely un-Orb feel in places, much colder and harsher than the name is usually associated with, but it's quite a lovely track in its own right, containing all of the melancholia of the original without any of the hideous schlock. Oldfield is signed to Warner after an almost ignominious end to his Virgin contract, and together they were keen to gain as much commercial and critical acclaim for the record as possible. Commercially it succeeded, it was Oldfield's first real success in almost a decade, and this single was clearly designed for the critics. It was even issued as a standalone disc away from the large number of conventional Sentinel singles, with the Designers Republic contracted to create art depicting the Tubular Bells logo in Orb style. Minus Alex Patterson, sometime Orb members Youth and Greg Hunter could be found providing remix duties on the opening 2 tracks of Sons of Arqa's Jaggernaut Whirling dub. The album, primarily material by Sons of Arqa, Michael Wadada's spiritual ragga crossover project active since the late 70s, remoulded by the pair as well as by Astralasia, the psychedelic trance offshoot of 80s space rock group the Magic Mushroom Band, is probably the first example of the ethno-fusion stylings of world music being incorporated into ambient dub, and provided something of a template for the psy-dub movement that would begin later in the decade. The Sons of Arqa's extensive live instrumentation brings an authentically Eastern vibe to the tone of things, perhaps more so than the more overtly synthetic outings the style would come to be dominated by. With 4 long tracks that are intentionally repetitive, the trippy psychedelic vibe, it's the start of a kind of music that feels clearly designed to accompany drug use, and the casual listener may find some elements long-winded, but there are some wonderful evocative atmospheres created here, especially in the 2 tracks with field recordings. Although not anywhere near as heralded as albums like the Infinity Project's Mystical Experiences, Jaggernaut Whirling Dove is just as formative in the creation of a new style of psychedelic down-tempo music. At this point, the Orb, alongside their collaborators, were the only outfit regularly exploring the dub end of the ambient world, but this was soon to change. In late August 1992, a small British label called Beyond launched with a compilation called Ambient Dub Volume 1, The Big Chill. Although containing one of the smallest catalogues of the 90s ambient labels, Beyond's music had quite an impact. The label didn't focus exclusively on ambient dub, but definitely aired on that side of the sound, releasing a further 3 volumes of this compilation series before it folded in 1996, and releasing music from some of the era's finest artists, including Higher Intelligence Agency, Another Fine Day and A Positive Life. The ambient dub scene would quickly grow, with labels like Planet Dog to become hugely successful, while in the US, Waveform would license much of Beyond's early material and continue the label's legacy well into the 21st century. But it all began with this compilation. At the time of release, none of the names on The Big Chill had releases to their name. Several tracks here are one-offs, with the artist releasing no further music. Such was the way with small independent scenes like this. As one would expect with the earlier entry in a genre, there's some crudeness here that would later be ironed out as the style developed. Certainly many of the tracks here air towards the dub more than the ambient, with the vibe frequently being closer to electronic dub than ambient dub in places. Nevertheless, there are still some very atmospheric pieces to be found on the album. Banco de Gaia, arguably the artist on the album to find the most success, debuted here with 2 tracks. Desert winds, layered voices and heavy tribal drums looking east and preempting the ethno-fusion wing of ambient that would feature heavily in the coming years. Similar sounds are found on GOL's Angelica and Delirium, although the spoken word moved that closer to the likes of Enigma than some of the cooler sounding pieces here. Despite a niche subgenre in the album's name, the one thing that this release isn't is homogeneous. Despite some deep bass and the use of delay, Mimoid's Strawberry is closer to laid-back trance than ambient dub, while his other piece, Tree of the Sun, Tree of the Moon, takes a break in the middle for a lengthy beatless passage replete with whale song. Banco de Gaia's Sufi is surprisingly low on dub elements altogether, instead sounding more like the kind of ambient industrial one might expect from one of Frontline Assembly's mellower spin-off projects. Alphanex and HIA rely less on traditional dub staples like drum loops, instead incorporating deep bass sounds within their synthetic tracks. The other thing that this release spearheaded was the label-led ambient compilation format, something that will go on to play a huge role in the market for the next few years. While Warp's first Artificial Intelligence compilation predates this release by a few weeks, and more on that next time, Ambient Dub Volume 1 feels very much like the template for a future series like Chill Out or Die, Ambient Systems and From Here to Tranquility. Horizon 222's Through the Round window frequently threatens to be a laid-back album. The opening few minutes are particularly gorgeous, but the Soviet France side project frequently reverts to pounding drums. Nevertheless, there's a dubby, spacey feel punctuated by birdsong and train samples that will no doubt appeal to many an Orb fan. Dub is certainly the main influence here, with countless sounds thrown through the shrill delay units that define the genre at its roots, while album closer Beyond the Horizon leans closer into ethnic sounds, recalling some elements of Soviet France's more tribal moments. It always feels like a bit of an outsider album to me, with the industrial elements of its members' usual style overriding any attempt to make it feel a consistent listen. But it's a bit of a cult favourite that has some very passionate fans and is worth a listen. Next time on the Rise and Fall of the Chill Out Room, I'll be looking at the development of ambient techno into IDM with releases on labels like Warp and Apollo. In the meantime, please drop me a comment. I'd love to know what you think of the music here, any memories you have connected with it, and there are also subscribe, share and like buttons you may want to press. And I'll see you next time.